Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. Friends and familiars, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a writer that has taken dark existential angst and combined it with sci-fi terror. He's joining me today to discuss his recent novel entitled The Gods Among Them. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Joe Scipione. All right, friends and familiars, we are live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and X with Joe Scipione, here to discuss his recent novel, The Gods Among Them. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk some books for a little while.
Absolutely, that's what we are here for, sir. Thank you for joining me on this first day of November 2024. I discovered your work through Ruth Ann Jagge's recommendation and was blown away by the surreal, bizarre nature of the setting and the plot. You've woven themes like the meaning of life, the existence of God, addiction, and quantum physics into a compelling piece of speculative fiction that dives deep into sci-fi horror. So thank you for joining us today to share more about this incredible story.
All right, thanks. I'm glad you liked it, and that's kind of what I was going for, was a little bit of everything.
Nice. Well, let's see here. Kind of a brief summation. The book follows Philip Mahan, a once employed family man, now living homeless in Chicago after losing everything to gambling, drugs, and alcohol. So you have firsthand knowledge of Chicago. How do you use the city's atmosphere to enhance the horror and speculative elements of your story? Because my father's from Chicago, so I have kind of faint, distant memories of, going downtown and the outskirts suburban areas.
Yeah, so my daughter has some physical disabilities, so we spend a lot of time, especially over the summers, kind of driving into the city. There were a few summers where she went in once a week, every single week. And you just drive in and out of the city. You kind of see the same areas of the city and the same spots. And you always come across homeless people as you're driving in, up underneath like the eaves of the underpasses there. And so I just always thought that it was kind of an interesting, different kind of way to go about writing a story, by looking not just at the characters, but at the city also, kind of to see how the characters would react to the city. And the beginning of the book and the end of the book too, I kind of wanted to look at kind of the city as a whole. If you read the first chapter, you kind of see it's more about the city, and then it kind of, like if you were watching a movie, it kind of zooms in on the characters themselves, but it starts looking at the city. And then towards the end of the book, you kind of do the opposite. You focus on Philip for most of the book, and now you're zooming out and seeing how he comes back into the city at the end of the book.
It's been a while, but I remember downtown being very close together, like very confined.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. The tall buildings, and they're kind of really on top of each other, and everybody's kind of packed in really close together, especially during the busy times.
Yeah, like Sears Tower. And so How does that affect the way the homeless people, I guess, just exist to begin with? Because I'm thinking of the way it is here in downtown Houston. I mean, there's some places that are really close together. I feel like I could use a more descriptive, more refined term than really close together, but you know what I mean. I just remember it being very almost claustrophobic the way things were kind of set together. Does that affect the overall, I guess, behavior of those folks down there? Does it affect their emotional well-being?
I didn't do any research on Chicago specifically when I was looking at it, but just from observations, like you can see they're trying to stay out of the way. Like they're trying to get into the places where there aren't a lot of people. And there's a scene in the book where, people are crossing the street to stay away from Philip. And, they're trying to walk as far away from him as they can until he passes. And then they go back on their way. And you just see a lot of that. Like people try to avoid the homeless people.
Okay. Well, he has a good friend named Lloyd who he met on the streets. And as the bitter Chicago winter approaches, he decides to venture into the suburbs to find a house to squat in. Lloyd refuses to go, but Lloyd's memory lingers in Philip's mind throughout the story. So you have an antagonist, confidant, and mentor in the story. What role does Lloyd's memory play?
So I wanted Lloyd to be, and actually also Philip's family, to be kind of that tether. Like there's so much strange stuff that happens to him when he's in the house, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but I wanted him to have like this tether to the normal world that's outside of all the strangeness. And Lloyd was kind of that tether for him. And then his family is also that tether. And his family has been the tether for him throughout his life since he left them. And now, and kind of Lloyd has taken that spot in his life because they've been together since he's been on the street. So now Lloyd and his family are kind of that tether to, this is why I'm continuing on. I want to stay focused in the real world, even though all of these strange things are happening inside the house.
Okay. Let me take a minute to welcome our live viewers on YouTube and Twitch. Thank you guys for stopping by. Please do stick around. We are talking with, if you're just joining us, we are talking with Joe Scipione about his recent novel that I would say is speculative fiction that dives really deep into the sci-fi horror realm. Very surreal, very bizarre. So stick with us here because we are going to dive into it very deeply. So circling back, there's a lot of detail in Philip's survival methods, especially in finding food. For instance, he frequents a dumpster behind a McDonald's next to a daycare, knowing children and rushed parents often leave uneaten food. So were these details fictional or did they come from research? Did you interact with the homeless at all, anywhere, as far as trying to understand life on the streets?
No, I watched a couple documentaries, none of them that focus specifically on Chicago. But that detail about the McDonald's by the daycare was just kind of a fictional thing that I kind of thought could happen. But there was in the documentaries, there was a lot of, these are good places to get food. This is where you can get food. And they would go to McDonald's or other fast food places looking for food or looking for people who might help them out.
Yeah. So you're saying you did see that particular, I guess, method and rationale in one of the documentaries, or you just kind of took something?
I took what I saw. They talked about going to McDonald's or fast food places, and I took that, okay, and then kind of made my own fictional thing about being near a daycare. Yeah,
I imagine there's some creative ways you come up with when you're, doing it to survive.
Right.
That's quite a drive to become very creative. Well, as you mentioned earlier, Philip constantly reflects on his wife and daughter along with Lloyd, wondering how they're doing. And I mean, he hasn't seen or spoken to them in years. So does he hold hope of reconnecting, or has he accepted the estrangement? And how does this affect his mental state and motivations?
I think he definitely wants to like reunite with them, not get back together with his wife or anything, but to see them again, to see his daughter again. Like, I think that is what kind of motivates him to continue to fight. You know, he's had such a terrible life living on the streets, but he still wants to survive. He's still trying to make himself better, and he wants to get back with his family to be able to see them again. So I think that's a big motivation for him, just to continue on and continue to fight and continue the struggle to see them again. And then once he meets Lloyd, Lloyd becomes one of those people also.
Yeah, and the thing I liked about it was, I mean, can you think of anything more upsetting? You know, you had it all. You had a home, a family, a child, and then you lost it all. He seems to deal with it in a very stoic way. Like I admire that both in fiction and in real stories that I've heard. And I sometimes wonder if I was put in that same situation, if I just wouldn't fall apart.
Right. Yeah. No, that was kind of taken also from the research a little bit. There was a gentleman who was talking about his family, and it was like very, very just factual. This is my family. And it wasn't an emotional thing. He was just talking about the family that he hadn't seen in years, and he hopes they're doing okay. And that was taken right from the research. And I thought kind of the same thing that you did. Like, very factual. There wasn't much emotion, but you can tell he still cared about them. Mm-hmm. And that's how I kind of saw Philip.
Yeah, it reminds me, speaking of stoically dealing with estranged family, did you ever see that film Shot Caller?
I haven't seen it.
Well, I guess if I tell you the ending, it's a spoiler, and it's a great movie, so I don't want to do that. But the decision this man that succumbs to probably one of the worst things that could happen to him as far as his family and his freedom. At the end, he has to make this horrific decision to keep his family safe. So if you haven't seen it, I would definitely check it out. It's called Shot Caller.
All right.
But circling back to the book, the house that Philip finds is obviously abandoned, and not just from the lack of, the signs of people around, but by the fact that the house is in a state of disrepair. So how did you approach pacing the story within such an isolated, enclosed setting? Were there challenges in maintaining suspense in a confined space? And I'm obviously just referring to the house. It doesn't completely exist there. The other places involved, obviously. Yeah. There's no problem making that interesting.
No, I don't outline. I do. I call it like scaffolding. I don't know if there's an actual like literary term for what I do. Basically, I come up with like 5 or 6 plot points that I want to write to. So I'll know the beginning, and then I'll know like 5 or 6 spots in the book or events in the book that I want to have happen, and then I get to the ending. So there were 3 points in the house that I wanted to get to. So I just wrote from that beginning part to the first one, and then to the second one. And then I kind of fill in, and most of the pacing and stuff that I do, I will look at after when I'm editing. So I'll just write, and I'll write to my 3 plot points. And then once I get them where I want them, when I go back and edit, I'll say, well, this, I talked for 5 pages about nothing really. I can shorten that down to a couple paragraphs. And that's when I look at pacing after the fact to see if I can speed it up and slow it down when the story gets too slow. But when I first write it, usually there's more words there because I want to get all the details in, and then I can take the words out to make it go faster.
Just kind of trim the fat a little bit.
Yep.
All right. Well, Philip discovers a bathtub full of dead mice on the first floor, which is a foreshadowing of darker events to come. And using a specific room as off limits is a highly effective plot device. So were you influenced by other famous, off limit rooms like room 237 in The Shining when you were creating this story?
I thought it was interesting that you asked that question because I'm a huge Stephen King fan, huge fan of The Shining. I don't think I was specifically thinking of The Shining when I wrote it, but when you mention it now, in my head, I'm like, oh, I probably was subconsciously influenced by that because, I read The Shining 3 or 4 times. I've seen the movie a whole bunch of times. So I was probably, yes, influenced by it, but more subconsciously than purposely.
Yeah. Yeah, the subconscious is constantly giving us the creative impulses we need, hence the dark mind.
Yeah.
Well, apart from the bathroom, the basement is the most ominous room in the house. But oddly, Philip feels relaxed and even euphoric inside the house and eventually craves its confines whenever he leaves. So, this sense of euphoria seems centered in the basement. Does Philip's tendency for addiction, I guess not tendency, predilection for addiction intensify this effect? Or would it be just as strong for anyone else? And can you kind of expand on that concept?
No, I think it probably kind of pushed him in that direction. But I do think that any person who went down there and spent a lot of time down there would feel the same way because there are other characters in the book who also kind of feel that. I call it the pull of the house or the pull of the basement. But I do think, like you said, he has a predilection for addiction already, and that's going to make it stronger for him.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I'm thinking of, well, I hope it's not a spoiler to, well, we're going to talk about Mike. We're going to talk about the owner. Yeah, so I guess I would have to assume that they have a predilection for addiction, which I don't think they did. Yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
And this next question, when I was talking to you before we started recording, I was like, I wanted to ask you the pronunciation of one of the characters, and here it is right here. Is it Marcia or Marcia?
Marcia.
Marcia, okay. All right. Well, while dumpster diving behind a restaurant, Philip meets a young woman named Marcia who comes out to empty some trash. Sympathetic to him, as she was once homeless herself, Marcia listens as Philip remarks that, quote, we're all hanging by a thread. Now, Philip's remark that we're all hanging by a thread is powerful, kind of Kafkaesque. How does this idea resonate throughout the novel, especially within the horror elements?
So that was added in after in editing. It wasn't there originally. I specifically remember adding in that little bit of dialogue. I think that for Philip, he was talking about, just being homeless, just trying to survive, just trying to get by. Marcia understood what he was talking about because she had been there before. But then as the story goes on, you realize that, I'm trying to say it without giving away too much. He starts to question things that are going on in the house, and you kind of feel that he's hanging up by a thread still as is in the house, even though it feels like to him things are getting better for him. He's in this, warm house, spending the nights inside versus outside on the street. He feels like things are getting better, but he's starting to question a lot of what's happening to him and around him. And he's kind of still hanging by that thread.
Yeah, it makes me, when I heard it, what I thought about was, as much as I hate, I don't know what it is, just the phrase itself, I guess it's kind of tied to religions is what makes me cringe, but for the grace of God go I sort of thing. We're all hanging by a thread, like, we're all like just a tragedy or an addiction or a medical catastrophe away from being in that position.
Right. You're right on the precipice of
hanging by a thread.
Yeah.
Well, just as things seem to be looking up for Philip, his peace is disrupted by a man named Michael Signori, who arrives to check on the house. He explains that the owner has tasked him with ensuring squatters haven't moved in. And Mike agrees to let Philip stay there and not call the police, but demands something vile and demeaning in return for his silence. So, Philip's predicament with Mike touches on themes of dignity and desperation. How did you handle these themes to maintain empathy for Philip while adding complexity to the horror?
Right. In all the books I read, I always think of like the worst monsters are the human ones. And Michael is that human monster in this book. And there's other things that happen and, other bad things and creatures and whatnot. But I think the creatures don't necessarily know that they're bad. They're just existing. And for Michael, he knows he's doing bad things. And he's I think the real monster of the book, because he knows what he's doing is wrong, doesn't really care, only cares about himself. And so I tried to really emphasize that, because I think it's important to look at the human monsters as well as the monsters.
Yeah, it's like this human consciousness we have. It's amazing. We do a lot of amazing things with it, but it's almost with all the neuroses and whatever else goes with it, it's like it makes us more dangerous.
Right. And for me, like when I'm reading a book, people always say, like, what's the scariest thing you read? When I read about monsters and ghosts and all this stuff, like I find it interesting and I like to read those kind of things. But if you said what really scares me, it would be something happening to my kids. Like for me, that's the scary thing that I don't really enjoy reading about as much, because that's something that could actually happen. And it's uncomfortable to read and it's tough to think about. But for me, that's the scary part of the book.
Yeah, that makes me want to ask you. So I'm not familiar with your other books. I don't know how violent they get, if there's anything that you won't write about. But when you talk about being scared of something happening to your kids and the real life monsters, I interviewed Paula D. Ash, I believe it was, and she was talking about how she had friends that were writers that would write about, children being injured, even killed in their books. But once they had kids, they were like, that's off limits, not happening anymore. And what she said was once she had kids, she was like, oh, great, now I have something new to be scared of, and just continued to write. So I was wondering, where are you in that realm?
I don't write about kids getting hurt too much, but if the plot warrants it, I will write, what needs to be written. But I think that there's a way to do it that leads to the story and is not necessarily, overly grotesque. Like I won't get super violent in a death scene with a kid. Like that for me doesn't work. But
not going to be writing splatterpunk.
Right. It'll be violent, but not necessarily with a kid involved. So I think there's a way to do it without necessarily having that violent aspect of it.
Gotcha. Well, during his stay, Philip has been awoken by intense vibrations accompanied by a blue light coming from within the house, vibrations that seem confined to the house because no neighbors have knocked and no authorities have been called. Sensory details like vibrations create a visceral sense of dread. So, what challenges did you face in conveying these sensations on the page, and what effect did you hope that it had on the readers?
So, that's a good question. When I've been writing for a long time. I started writing in like 2002, 2003. And I went through a phase, I was just writing short stories, and I was like, I want to write a short story or 6 short stories where I focus on one sense. So I wrote about a story about a guy who had this blindfold on, he couldn't take it off. So I had to take away all visual aspects. And then there was another one where the guy couldn't hear. And there was another one where the character couldn't speak. And I was trying to just play with different senses so that I could learn to write with talking about the other senses. So if you're blind or if you can't take the blindfold off, then all the stuff that you describe has to be described using the other senses. And I feel like the stories weren't good, I don't think, but I feel like it kind of taught me how to use the other senses when I'm writing something and the person has all of their senses. And so that's what I try to do whenever I'm writing a scene. I always think about not just what can the character see, but what can they see, what can they hear, what can they feel, and those vibrations I tried to really think about. And I did a lot of going back and thinking about, if I close my eyes, how would these vibrations feel, and make sure that I describe that as best I could.
Well, the vibrations and blue light mark the beginning of a slow burn progression into the mystery of the basement. Philip then discovers a large hole in the floor, a chasm so deep the bottom is invisible, with bright blue globes glowing from within. Boy, try saying that. Bright blue globes glowing from within. So, what do you hope readers feel when they encounter this description? Curiosity, fear, or perhaps a mix of both?
Probably both, but I would say for me, when I read a book, it's me trying to figure out what's going to happen next. Where is the story going? If I'm asking those questions as I'm reading the book, then I'm hooked, and I'm not putting the book down. So I think for curiosity is kind of the main one for me, because I want, if the reader's going, well, what's going on with this hole? Well, what's down there? If they keep thinking about it and coming up with different scenarios in their head of what could be down there as they're reading, and they don't want to stop reading because they're trying to figure it out along with Philip, then I feel like I'm doing my job, because if they're feeling the same thing that he's feeling, that's exactly where they should be as readers.
Gotcha. Well, after close contact with the chasm in the basement, Philip encounters Marcia, who seems uneasy around him, noticing his dramatic, almost overnight improvement in health. He had been on the street, he was skin and bones. I imagine he just had like this general pallor to his skin, and apparently all of a sudden looked really good. Marcia's unease hints that Philip's transformation may not be entirely positive. So how did you use character reactions like hers to foreshadow the potential dangers of the chasm?
Well, I think it's the same thing, kind of that curiosity where she's noticing these changes in him, and she notices these changes in him. And so now the reader sees how she reacts to him. And once again, they're like, well, what's going on down there that's causing this? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is there something that I'm missing, or something that, because it's all from Philip's point of view, that you're not necessarily seeing as the reader? So it's more of that curiosity and kind of building, because you don't know exactly what's happening, and neither does Marcia when she comes over and she sees him, and she kind of gets nervous around him.
Well, as stranger things happen in the house, Philip begins to wonder if he's losing his mind. So he asks Marcia to come over to confirm if she sees what he's seeing. And surprisingly, she agrees and follows him into the basement. And I mean, I'm following Philip's introspection the entire time. It's kind of weird that she's like, oh yeah, I'll come to an abandoned house with you and by myself. And oh, you want to walk down into a dark basement? Yeah, I'll do that. So surprisingly, she agrees and follows him into the basement. In the darkness, she trips and severely injures herself, but is miraculously healed by the seeming proximity to the chasm. So by validating or questioning Philip's experiences, does Marcia help ground him, or does her presence add more tension to his unraveling?
That's another good question. That's kind of what I was going for. Was first, she's feeling that, well, we talked about the pull of the basement earlier. The reason she goes down there, even though she probably shouldn't go down there, is she's kind of feeling that pull too. He asked her to come over, check this out. She kind of trusts him, kind of doesn't, but she feels that pull from the basement too. So when he says, come down and look at this, she says, sure, I'll take a look.
By validating or questioning Philip's experiences, does she actually help ground him? Like, okay, she sees it, so I'm good. Or does her presence add more attention to his unraveling emotionally,
Right.
psychologically?
Yeah. So she was a tether to that regular world, and then she gets pulled into it. And so now Lloyd is that tether and his family has that tether, but Marsha was one too. And now she's kind of pulled in with him. And it seems like they're going to go down the spiral and do this thing together.
Yeah, now it makes sense because, I mean, the book is so well written, and I was just thinking, why? It doesn't make sense that she would go down into that basement. I understand going to the house a little because she just, sees good in him. But going down to a dark basement, that makes sense. The draw we were talking about. She doesn't have a predilection for addiction, at least I don't remember. But she was still drawn regardless of her safety, a woman like some guy
Right.
She doesn't know, hey, will you go down to this dark basement? Okay. It makes sense now.
Yeah.
Well, beyond dreading Mike's weekly visits, how did these encounters affect Philip emotionally and psychologically? Was getting rid of Mike an experiment or a result of reaching his breaking point? Like, was he trying to see what happened?
No, he was definitely trying to see what happens because he really wants to go down there. He knows he probably shouldn't just, dive in. So he's like, okay, I could do this. I can get rid of my problem that I have and I can see what happens.
Gotcha. Well, sci-fi horror can have many types of antagonists, from internal struggles to supernatural forces. So how did you decide on the antagonist's form and motives?
So, like I said, I think Michael is the bigger antagonist here. And I think that I just wanted Philip to be able to have this person to look at and say, this is not who I want to be. This is not what I want to have around. And then we'll do whatever he can to kind of get rid of that.
It's kind of weird. There was at one point he's crying. Like, if he had a backstory, or at least a more extensive backstory, what would be some things that might be included in his background? Because his behavior was just bizarre.
I think he drinks a lot of drugs, and he probably works like 80 hours a week, like just trying to get by, kind of like that hanging on a thread thing. Like, he's just trying to get by, but he's got that, he's got the place to live. So he's trying to make extra money just to kind of get by like everybody else. And he's just barely getting by.
Okay. Gotcha. Well, I'll let you relax because I know that we've been trying to prevent spoilers for quite some time. I will say it was a great book. Listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. So we've talked about research you did about the homeless population, watching some documentaries and things like that. Did your story require any particular research into the realm of quantum physics? And if so, how did you decide which details to incorporate to enhance the believability?
I did no research into quantum physics at all. And it all just kind of came off the head. So as we kind of get towards that part of the book, it was just like, what seems right? What would make sense here? I just put it all out there.
Yeah, that's what's crazy about quantum physics is somebody could be just making stuff up.
Right.
And you wouldn't know because it's so bizarre. It sounds like the ramblings of somebody that's high.
Yeah. I was not high during the writing of the book.
Oh, of course not. Yeah. Wait. No. Let the record reflect. Mr. Scipione was not high during the writing of this book. Well, how has reader feedback influenced your writing process, especially for this novel? Did any feedback prompt unexpected changes or insights?
No, I have like one beta reader. I send him pretty much everything, every long thing that I write. I would send him stuff for like 6 or 7 years. So I know that when I send him stuff. He will pick out any plot holes, find anything that just doesn't make sense. And he'll also give me notes on things that can be expanded upon, cool stuff that I should add more of. But he's really the only one that I will send a book out to while I'm editing. So I'll write it, I'll edit it a bunch, like 2 or 3 times. I'll send it to him. He'll send me back stuff, and then I edit it another 2 or 3 times, and then it's off to the publisher after that.
Gotcha. Well, tell me about this amazing cover here. Let me bring it up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
That is, that's pretty solid.
Christian Benchulon, I think is how you pronounce it. I'm not exactly sure. He does all of the Wicked House publishing covers, and he just does an amazing job. We had a couple different ideas of what we wanted to do. So I think that he made 2 or 3 different covers that we had. And then this one, I was just like, this is awesome. We have to go with this one. The font is great. We talked about having something in the middle of that hole, but I kind of like the emptiness of it because it fits so well with the story that there's just nothing there. So we just went with it. And it's probably my favorite cover of all my books.
And how many books do you have?
This is actually book number 10. So I've got 4 novellas out. I have a short story collection out. And then this is the 5th novel.
Okay. Yeah. Andrew Nyberg in particular speaks very highly of Christian Benchulon.
Yeah.
I think he's done at least 2 of his covers. Can't remember, but yeah. Yeah, he speaks very highly of him. Yeah, him and Don Noble seem to be like the heavy hitters when it comes to doing book covers. Yeah.
And Don's done 4 or 5 of my book covers also.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, you have quite a bibliography of both novels and short stories with an extensive list of short stories that I believe have been published in a lot of different anthologies. So how did you decide which ideas become full-length novels versus short stories?
So usually if I have like an idea, like I wrote a pirate novella. It came out last year. It's called The Life and Times of Edward Morgan. And like I had this idea. I didn't really know, like I talked about that scaffolding earlier. I knew the beginning, I knew the end, and I knew nothing else when I started writing it. And I just kind of wrote, and then about halfway through, I kind of had a couple points I wanted to get to. And I realized, okay, this is going to be about 35,000 words, which is a novella. And 3/4 of it was written on my phone. And then I copy it from my phone, put it on the computer, and then I'll finish it there and edit it. But it's more like, this is just something I can jump in. There's not as much kind of complexity as the novels. I can just jump in. I know exactly where I'm going and type it out on the phone when I get a chance. And they're usually written like over the summer. Is usually when I have a little less time to write because my kids are at home and there's just a lot more going on. So usually over the summer, I'll say, okay, what novella, what short stuff am I going to write this summer? And I have a couple different ideas and I'll write one out over the summer. And then the longer things, usually like that pirate book, I had the idea and then 2 days later I was writing. Like for this book, the Gods Among Them, I kind of came up with character sheets and it's just a lot more kind of brainstorming that involved. So I got the idea and then 3 months later I started writing it. So it's just a lot more involved as far as brain work ahead of time versus just jumping in and writing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't know why. I love hearing about people talking about writing on their phones. There's somebody somewhere that's just thumbing away on their phone. And you're like, oh, they must be texting somebody or, just playing some game or something. Like, no, they're writing the next great American novel.
Yeah. No, when I first started doing it, my son had some testing done and I was just in the waiting room at the doctor's office for like an hour. And I didn't have a computer. I didn't have a notebook. So I just pulled out my phone and I just started typing on it. And I ended up typing for 45 minutes and I had like the beginning of a novella. And it was hard at first because it's so much different than typing on a computer. Like it's a lot slower for me, but it worked. And so I kind of keep that up over the summers.
You must have big sausage thumbs like I do.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, which writing influence pushed you from dabbling to publishing?
I don't think there's like a specific person. When I think about like authors who influenced me, Stephen King is a big one, but I feel like for Stephen King, he made me like want to be a reader. So I would, every time a new Stephen King book came out, I would go to the bookstore like the first day it came out, and I just sit and read it. And then I go back and read other stuff, but it was always Stephen King, Stephen King, Stephen King. And then when I thought, oh, maybe I'll write something, I felt like I was Joe Scipione trying to write a Stephen King book versus Joe Scipione trying to write a Joe Scipione book. And as I read more and as I wrote more, I kind of found a voice that was my own. And I wasn't trying to necessarily copy other writers, but trying to make my own voice stand out more. And there's a lot of influences, like we talked about The Shining. And I'm sure if I looked and studied it, I'd see other authors' influence in my work. But I think for me, it's more about being influenced by my earlier stuff that I wrote. So if I look back at the first book I wrote, which is terrible and no one will ever read it, if I look back at that and then look at where the stuff I'm writing now, if that's better, I'm sure it is, I'll think of it as, an influence and kind of a growth within myself.
So maybe not necessarily a particular influence, but you were talking about gradually finding your voice. Was there a time or an impetus that you can think of where it's just like, you were writing a lot and talking about stuff that you wrote that you didn't particularly like, but was there anything that took you from dabbling to like, you know what, I'm going to write and I'm going to write until this thing is completed and published?
Not necessarily like a book. I had been writing for a while, and I think my first like published story was in 2009, and it was a Western horror. It was a submission call. He was looking for Western horror short stories. And I was like, oh, I like Westerns. I write horror. I can probably do this. And I hand wrote it. And I just remember feeling like that it was the first time where I felt like I wasn't being Joe Scipione writing a Stephen King story. That was like my voice. I could tell the difference between the stuff I had written before and this story. And like right from the very first word, like you could tell there was a difference between the way I was writing and the voice of that piece versus all the other things I had written before then. And like over the years, I can still feel myself, even now, I can still feel myself kind of falling and losing the voice that I've written in over the years. But now I can notice it within a sentence or two and I can kind of fix it. Whereas I couldn't do that when I first started. But that Western horror, and I can't remember the title of the story right now, but it was the first story that I had published in print. It was 2009. And I was so excited. And I was definitely like feeling different about that story versus the other stuff that I had written.
Well, you said when we were talking earlier that you had one person that was kind of like your beta reader.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So do you read reviews?
If you ask me officially, I'd say no. But I read a lot of them. So I try not to, especially not the good ones. I saw Joe Lansdale did a panel, I think it was at StokerCon a couple of years ago. And he said, the best thing you can do is never read reviews because the good ones aren't going to make you better. And the bad ones probably aren't going to make you better either because they're just hating on you or something like that. So I try to do that. I definitely don't read the bad ones. I don't think it helps necessarily. And I will usually read the good ones, especially when people tag me in them. Usually I end up reading those, but I don't read the bad ones very much. And I try not to read the good ones very much either, but usually they end up in front of me.
Yeah, I forget who I was talking to. I didn't realize it, but there's full on book trolls. Like, I'm well aware of people trolling social media, just being nasty for no reason, but I didn't realize it happened with like book reviews. So possibly the gentleman, your beta reader, or possibly from a DM or one of the reviews that you, of course, don't read, but maybe you do. What is the most interesting feedback that you've ever gotten from a reader?
I don't know about interesting. The most helpful things are like plot holes, because I think when I get focused on it, and because I don't outline and I kind of just have those plot points that I'm writing toward, I think that the most helpful things are those plot holes, because I'm seeing this big picture story, and I have the whole story in my head trying to get it on paper, and there's always going to be something that you're just going to miss, or that isn't going to make sense once you tie everything together in the end. So the most helpful thing is always those plot holes, because I usually have like one per book, especially when it's a long book. And he'll always be like, oh, this doesn't make any sense because you said this back here on page, whatever. And I'll go back and fix it. And usually it's a small thing and pretty easy to fix, but definitely the most helpful.
Gotcha. Well, is there anything that you avoid because you believe it stifles your creativity?
I try not to watch too much TV, if that makes sense. So I love movies, but I struggle with like long TV shows. So like people have said, Breaking Bad is the greatest TV show that's ever existed. I've watched like 3 episodes of it. I just have trouble with like those longer TV shows because I feel like it's so long, like there's no end in sight. Like it's a constant story. The story's always evolving. It's always going and you're never getting to the end. And I feel like being able to see in a movie, you have the beginning, the middle, the end. You could see the whole story in 2 hours. Well, you can't sit and watch Breaking Bad for 2 hours. You only get 2 episodes in. So because the story's so long and drawn out, it's hard for me to be able to kind of look and analyze and see that story from beginning to end. So I don't like those kind of long drawn out TV series that a lot of people love.
Yeah, I can do a movie, although I haven't watched a movie in quite some time. Me and my wife love watching horror movies, but we're usually so busy we don't have the time for it. But yeah, I haven't been into television shows for a while. As you said, it just takes forever to binge watch something because it's like you want to know how it ends, but you got to go through seasons to get to the ending.
It's 14 hours to find out the ending. And so that's why, like, I'm a big Star Trek fan, and I can watch a Star Trek episode because you have the beginning, you got the middle, and then 45 minutes later, there's an ending. And then you go to the next episode, and it's just a new story, beginning, middle, end. But the newer shows, for whatever reason, that kind of long, drawn-out series, it's just a 45-hour movie, and you never really get that ending. So I struggle with those.
Well, what is the greatest benefit you receive from being a writer?
Honestly, it's hearing from readers and just, even if it's just like I got a DM the other day, they were reading actually this book and they finished it and they just sent a DM and said, I love this book. It's one of my favorites of all time. Like to me, that's awesome. And I think a lot of people don't realize, like, when you're writing, it's such a solitary thing. And like a DM like that takes 2 seconds to write. And it means the world because sometimes you just feel like you're writing and nobody is reading anything that you're writing. And so to get that kind of feedback, quick little thing, it just helps so much to kind of motivate you to keep writing.
Well, have you been to any literary cons lately? And, actually, I think you just mentioned one earlier. And can you tell us about them? I was looking through let me bring it up here, your Instagram. And did I see any pictures on here or?
Mostly book covers. There's the dog. I went to, it's called Beyond the Book Festival It's in Indiana. They have it every year. That's an old dog photo.
Do you have any pictures of the con on your social media?
I don't know if I do. It's not just a horror con. It's at a library in Knox, Indiana. They do an amazing job. They shut down the whole library, and it's just filled with authors and books. Everybody's selling stuff. They have the whole community comes through. It was a really good time. And then usually I go to StokerCon. I didn't go this past year, but I have been the previous 5 or 6. And that's more, it's not sit at tables and sign books. It's more geared for writers. So there's lots of panels and stuff like that versus sitting and signing books. But that's always a good conference to go to.
Gotcha. Well, so kind of the way that I was led to your work by Ruth Ann Jaggi, she is in, and you'll have to explain it a bit to me, Books and Brews with you?
Correct.
Yeah.
So that is through the Books of Horror Facebook group. They did an event last year. One of the moderators of the group actually lives close by here in Illinois. And so they asked me to go last year, or I wanted to go last year because it was right here. It was like 45 minutes from my house. And it was like the one weekend of the entire summer that I just couldn't go. And I guess it was a huge event. They did some awesome stuff. There was a ton of authors there, a ton of people there. It was in a brewery. That's why they call it Books and Brews. And so then this year it's in Indiana. I forget where in Indiana, somewhere just outside Indianapolis. And I guess there's more authors. It's a bigger brewery. So that's coming up this summer.
Awesome. Well, it is November 1st. Yesterday was October 31st. How was Halloween?
It was good. My daughter, she has CP and autism, and last year she got sick on Halloween. So Halloween's like one of her favorite things. She wanted to go out trick-or-treating last year. We had costumes all picked out, and she was so sick, she couldn't even get off the couch. And so we felt bad. She didn't even end up going out or getting a costume on or anything. And then this year came around, and she was pumped and she was ready. So we had the whole family dress up as the Incredibles.
Nice.
And so we walked around the neighborhood as the Incredibles. She always has a theme for what she wants us to dress up as. And this year was the Incredibles. So it was good.
Sweet. Well, would you like to read a passage from the book?
I actually don't have it. Oh, maybe I can do it this way. Hang on. I'm going to read that first chapter, or part of the first chapter. Let me get it pulled up here. All right, I'm gonna read that first half of the first chapter. Before the sun rises in the morning, the city doesn't look much different than it does in the middle of the night. In the moments just before the sun pokes up over the horizon, the street lights still illuminate the sidewalks and roadways, while shadowy figures of night continue roaming, comforted by the cover of darkness. However, the impending daylight is mere seconds away, and those figures know they must soon return to their place of refuge until darkness covers the city like a blanket for yet another evening. Once the sun rises, the city changes. Men and women drive to the city for work, and the streets fill with the red brake lights and the blare of honking horns. Full-time residents of the city join the commuters and get lost in the throng of people walking one direction or another to work, or to go shopping at the high-end shops, or to become tourists and see the sights of the place long known as the Windy City. Lost in the throng of people moving about the city from one destination to the next are the people who call the city home, though they have no permanent residence, no place of their own to bear that name. These people do not go inside at night when the dark figures roam the streets. They do not use cars to get around the city, and they do not have money to shop or to visit the tourist attractions surrounding them. Yet when they call the city home, they mean it in the truest sense of the word. While commuters take the Stevenson to get into the city, These men and women sleep in the eaves under the highway's bridges, covered in blankets and wrapped in coats, while cars and trucks thunder past above their heads. Some live in groups, drawing strength from others who find themselves in the same situation, homeless, hungry, in need of assistance that rarely, if ever, comes. Others live on their own, content to fend for themselves in the unforgiving city. All of them are treated as barely human by most, if not all, of the people they see on a daily basis. People on foot will cross the street if they see them coming. If they don't, they will do their best to avoid eye contact. These people stare straight ahead, focused on not looking at the homeless man or woman next to them, picking up their pace until they are on to the next block. People in cars are just as inhumane as those on foot. Drivers will roll up windows and lock doors if they see one of these homeless coming toward them. They say they want to help people, yet do everything in their power to avoid speaking to or even seeing those who need help the most. This unseen, unwanted part of Chicago is where Philip Mahan lives his life. It isn't the life he wanted to live when he was a little boy. It isn't the one he imagined on his wedding day when he celebrated with 500 of his friends and family at an expensive downtown hotel. But life happened, and it is where he finds himself now. He doesn't love his life, but it's the hand he's been dealt. He makes do the best way he knows how, with friends and hopes of a better future. Philip lets out a groan when he rolls over onto his back. A chill runs through his body. On the street, this kind of chill doesn't go away by bundling up or moving around for a while. This kind of chill, a feeling Philip has grown accustomed to over the last 10 winters, lives in your bones. And once it sets in, it takes days or even weeks to thaw. Years of sleeping outside on hard surfaces have been hell on his spine, and each morning it takes a little longer to get up and force his body into a standing position. But he gets there, though not without the creaking and cracking of a back that doesn't ever seem to be in perfect alignment anymore. Once standing, a heap of blankets and trash and other detritus of the street piled at his feet, Philip looks around. There are 3 other heaps hidden in the eaves of the bridge. He doesn't know 2 of the people buried under their own blankets for warmth, but one heap, the one closest to him, is his best friend, Lloyd. Like Philip, Lloyd has been on the streets for almost 10 years. They met when each man thought the situation would be temporary. They talked then about dreams for the future, discussed what they would do once they were back on their feet. In some ways, they have the same conversation now. But now dreams of the future and plans for their money are followed by the laughs of 2 men who realize the road they're on may not end where they originally intended. We'll stop there.
Mic drop. Very good, sir. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, last but not least, what is the life of Joe Scipione like outside of writing?
So I stay home. I told you about my daughter. She needs a lot of help at home. So I would say I write full time, but I do a lot for her when she's not at school. So I'm not working outside of writing. I get her off in the morning to school, and then I get stuff done around the house, do some writing during the day, and then after school, when the kids get home, I'm kind of with them, and then I do a little bit more writing at night. Take the dog for a walk around. We got a couple of lakes here nearby, so we walk around there, watch some sports or movies at night, and that's about it.
You say you got a couple of lakes here. Are you referring to the Great Lakes?
No, not that big.
Okay.
They're more like ponds.
Okay. Well, Joe, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
No, just go by The Gods Among Them. That just came out. Today's actually release day for that. And then I had a novella come out in September that is called And Then I Killed All the Ghosts. So go buy those, check them out. I got 10 books. You can go read if you like those.
Awesome. Well, definitely do stick around when we disconnect and just have some quick information to give you.
Sure.
But listeners at home, both live and on demand, all links are in the description. And Joe, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you. This was fun.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can watch the episodes live. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest writers and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.